the morning mist clung to the Northumbrian coast like a funeral shroud. As the first dragon-prowed longships emerged from the North Sea's grey embrace, it was January 8, 793 AD, and the monks of Lindisfarne had no idea they were about to witness and suffer history. Its most shocking announcement that the age of European isolation was ending forever. What began as distant sails on the horizon would unleash 3 centuries of terror, transformation, and ultimately, the forging of a New England. The attack on Lindisfarne wasn't just another Reddit, was a declaration of war against an entire worldview. For centuries, Christian monasteries had stood as beacons of learning and sanctity, their wealth openly displayed in golden crucifixes and jeweled manuscripts, protected only by the assumption that no one would dare assault God's house. The Vikings shattered that assumption with systematic brutality that left chroniclers struggling for words. "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain," wrote the scholar Alcuin, "nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made." But here's what makes this invasion truly extraordinary. The Vikings didn't just come to pillage and leave. They came to stay, to conquer, and to reshape the very DNA of English civilization in ways that echo through our language, laws, and culture today. The Great Heathen Army. When raiders became conquerors. The transformation from opportunistic raids to systematic conquest began in 865 AD, with the arrival of what Anglo-Saxon chroniclers called the Great Heathen Army, a coalition of Viking forces unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Led by the legendary sons of Ragnar Lothbrokr the Boneless, Halfdan, and Abat, this wasn't a raiding party, but a professional military machine designed for permanent conquest. The numbers alone were staggering. Conservative estimates suggest the Great Army comprised between 5,000 to 10,000 warriors, supported by thousands more followers, craftsmen, and farmers. In a Britain where the largest kingdoms could barely muster 2,000 troops, this represented an overwhelming force that could strike anywhere along England's extensive coastline with devastating effect. Their strategy was revolutionary. Unlike previous raiders who struck and withdrew, the Great Army established fortified camps called burhs at strategic river junctions, creating permanent bases that allowed them to control transportation and communication networks. York fell in 866, becoming Jorvik, a thriving Viking capital. East Anglia collapsed entirely, its King Edmund tortured to death in a ritual execution that would make him a martyr and saint. The psychological warfare was equally devastating. The Vikings perfected the blood eagle, a ritualistic execution where the victim's ribs were broken, and lungs pulled out like wings specifically to terrorize their enemies into submission. Whether historically accurate or propaganda, the mere whisper of such practices spread panic ahead of Viking armies. Alfred's England, the birth of a nation through fire by 878 AD. 3 of the 4 great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia, had fallen. Only Wessex, under a young king named Alfred, remained independent. And even Wessex teetered on the brink of collapse. When Guthrum's winter surprise attack drove Alfred into the marshes of Somerset, reduced to leading a guerrilla resistance from the island fortress of Athelney. This is where our story takes its most dramatic turn, because Alfred's response to near-total defeat would create something unprecedented. The idea of England itself. Trapped in the marshes, Alfred didn't just survive, he evolved, studied his enemies obsessively, learning their tactics, their motivations, their strengths and weaknesses. When he emerged from Athelney to win the crucial Battle of Edington, he did something no Anglo-Saxon king had ever done. He negotiated not just a truce, but a transformation. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum in 886 AD created the Danelaw legal recognition that England was now permanently divided between Anglo-Saxon and Viking territories. But rather than accepting defeat, Alfred used this division as a blueprint for unification. He began calling himself King of the Anglo-Saxons. Not just King of Wessex, a revolutionary title that implied authority over all English-speaking peoples, whether currently under his control or not. Alfred's military reforms were equally transformative. He created the first standing navy in English history, built a network of fortified towns burhs that could resist siege warfare, and established a rotation system that kept half his army always ready for battle, while the other half maintained the economy. These weren't just military innovations. They were the foundation of medieval European statecraft. The forging of England, when enemies became countrymen. But here's the twist that makes this invasion truly world-changing. The Vikings didn't just conquer England, they became England. In the Danelaw territories, something unprecedented was happening. Viking settlers were intermarrying with Anglo-Saxon locals, creating a hybrid culture that was neither purely Scandinavian nor purely English. Archaeological evidence from York, Lincoln, and other Viking centers reveals communities where Norse metalworkers crafted Anglo-Saxon jewelry patterns, where Christian churches incorporated Norse artistic motifs, and where Viking longships evolved into English trading vessels. The linguistic fusion was even more profound. Over 900 English words derive from Old Norse, including fundamental terms like sky, egg, knife, husband, anger, ugly, wrong, die, give, get, have, and are. These aren't borrowings of exotic foreign concepts. They're the basic vocabulary of human existence, suggesting the deepest possible cultural integration. Even more remarkably, Viking legal concepts revolutionized English jurisprudence. The word law itself comes from Old Norse lag. Viking assemblies things introduced concepts of trial by jury and representative government that would eventually influence the development of parliament. The Danelaw's emphasis on individual rights and compensation, rather than collective punishment, helped shape the English common law tradition that would spread across the world. The final transformation. When invasion became evolution, the ultimate irony of the Viking invasion becomes clear when we examine its end. In 1066, the last great Viking invasion failed spectacularly when Harold Hardrada fell at Stamford Bridge. 3 weeks later, William the Conqueror himself, descended from Viking settlers in Normandy, conquered England at Hastings. But by then, the transformation was complete. The England that fell to Norman rule was un't the same England that had trembled before Viking longships in 793. It was a hybrid nation, forged from Anglo-Saxon resilience and Viking innovation that had developed the military, administrative, and cultural systems that would eventually make it a world power. The monasteries that Vikings once burned became centers of learning that preserved both Anglo-Saxon and Norse traditions. The trading networks Vikings established evolved into the commercial systems that would fund England's later expansion. The military innovations born from Anglo-Saxon Viking conflict created the tactical foundations for medieval English warfare supremacy. Perhaps most profoundly, the English language itself, Englished by Norse vocabulary and simplified by the need for Anglo-Saxon and Viking. Communities to communicate became more flexible and adaptable than either of its parent tongues, perfectly positioned to become the world's lingua franca a millennium later. Legacy of the longships. How Viking invasion created modern England. The Viking invasion of England was, unjust a medieval conflict, it was the violent birth of a new civilization. From the terror of Lindisfarne to the synthesis of the Danelaw. From Alfred's desperate resistance to the cultural fusion that followed. These 3 centuries of struggle created the template for England's future greatness. Today, when English is spoken in boardrooms from Tokyo to Sao Paulo, when English common law governs courts from Sydney to Singapore, when English parliamentary democracy inspires governments from Ottawa to New Delhi, we're witnessing the final victory not of the Vikings or the Anglo-Saxons, but of the hybrid civilization their collision created. The dragon ships have long since rotted away, but their wake still shapes our world. In every English word we speak, every legal principle we follow, every democratic tradition we cherish, the ghost of those first Viking raiders still sails among us, no longer as destroyers, but as the unwitting architects of the modern world.